All right, so this is the last topic for the semester. It's going to be on urbanization and the environment. It's going to be a very small lecture, and this with this we finish this semester. I had earlier a topic on environmental policies, but given this very fluid situation, I know you guys are struggling with keeping up with the high demand. So I'm going to let that particular topic slide away. That will not be part of your exam. I will not cover that topic as a lecture. You already have more than enough to cover. All right, let's progress into this particular topic. So let's talk about the population trends in urban areas. So urban populations are increasing, by the year across the globe, right? And half of the global population, right, lives in urban areas. And this actually leads to urban sprawl. What do you mean by urban sprawl? Urban sprawl refers to growth of urban environments from the urban center outside, right? So as a result, what happens is, like gradually, the urban center keeps expanding, right? So urban center first start as a small town, and then it becomes, like then what happens is people who work in the town, right, in the city, right, maybe for factories, okay, maybe in schools, they have residential areas. They develop residential areas immediately outside it, right? And then what happens with actually population growth happens, there will be it creates more job opportunities. So there will be bigger industrial parks, bigger offices, and that actually displaces the original residential area. So the residential area moves further and further out like that. When the urban center grows with industrialization, other infrastructure, right, and other services, the urban center will keep growing, right? And concurrently, the residential area will keep growing at the urban fringe. So ultimately, an urban area that started as a small town will keep growing and literally sprawling all over the landscape. That's what urban sprawl is. So in the United States, over 80% of the US population lives in urban areas. In China, over 50% of the population occupies cities. Um, so the growth of an urban environment happen in two folds. Why it is so high? Because there are natural births happening within the city, and then people from rural areas migrate to the urban environment, which is actually partly not bad if you're looking at the conservation aspect of it. Rather than letting rural areas and exurban areas grow at the expense of natural land use land cover heights, it's better for the rural urban growth the rural population growth to migrate towards the cities. In fact, that's one of the um, conservation strategies that has been recommended by the United Nations, and I believe it's a great movement. But what we need to know is that growth of urban environment in itself creates environmental issues, but it's not something unmanageable, so don't look at that as a bad thing. Now what is a mega city? Mega cities are cities that actually have population at about 10 million, right? Several examples. There are many examples. The map actually shows, playing by different years, um, where you're going to see urban cities. Sorry, mega cities, right? So Tokyo um, is one of them. Shanghai is one of them. Peking, one of them. Hong Kong, one of them, right? Um, and in the U.S., New York City is one of them, right? Um, and by 2015, at global scale, there are at least 30 megacities, right? And 22 of those megacities are located in developing countries. So this megacity problem is not a first world problem. It's in fact a developing world problem, right? India has a couple of megacities, and there will be more megacities in India and China within the next 50 years. And now what you can see is if you look at the map for a second, right, it actually plays, it is starting from I think 2010, it will show in 15-year or so succession in future years how those megacities will grow. What you are going to notice is, yes, it starts with fewer megacities and the number of megacities increases, and the size of the megacity in terms of population size increases. Corresponding to that, the actual surface extent of the megacity also bloats up, right? And as a result, what happens is two nearby mega cities will actually merge with each other, creating what's known as a hypercity, which hypercity by definition is a clustering of urban mega regions, right? So and if you look at the map, most of those mega cities in future will happen in most likely southern Asia and maybe even in Africa. And in fact, that's alarming. The rate at which it's happening, it could be more that urban growth could supersede the urban growth happening in the first world. Um, so what? What's the problem with this urban growth? Well, one of the most characteristic signatures of urban environments, as detected by remote sensing systems, is urban light, right? Creates light pollution, and light is how certain species navigate, move, or that's how they actually maintain their activity patterns. That's how they drive their behavior. um that's how they use light for navigation purposes, right? And you have heard about the sea turtles are being impacted by coastal development because they actually move towards the light rather than towards the sea when the turtles hatch. So there are many other similar situations being observed regarding nocturnal birds like nightjars and owls being impacted by night lights. There, it could reduce their activities. It could impact their foraging behavior. Urban light could also impact bats' foraging activities and their movements and their reproductive behaviors. The same thing regarding noise. Urban environments are noisy environments. What happens with the noise? Well, the actual the electromagnetic spectrum that animals have for communication, either by visual signals or by um, acoustics, is actually limited. There's a particular range of nanometers, right? So when there is urban noise, the urban noise is extremely cluttered environment, so that urban noise could occupy or take over most of that electromagnetic spectrum, partly for the light, partly for the noise. So whatever left, the empty space, empty acoustic niche or the empty electromagnetic niche within the electromagnetic spectrum is going to be what the wildlife can use. So the urban wildlife is actually a very smaller fraction of the regional species pool, not only because of the other biological environmental stresses, not because of other forms of chemical and physical pollution, not because of hunting, not just because of habitat loss. Even those species that can actually co-inhabit um, as human commensals who can actually live within smaller conservation lands, smaller woodlots, smaller urban parks. Um, Even those highly adaptive species may even have a problem with communicating with each other because the electromagnetic spectrum of urban environments is largely occupied by light, like urban artificial light and urban noise. Just to show you the impact of urban light during nighttime, right? I mean, this is kind of an image that shows, major cities, their population sizes, and how much it creates a new landscape with this kind of urban lighting. And look at how well lighted the eastern part of North America is, and also look at the Western Europe, right? Look at Japan, right? There are very prominent these hotspots that appears when you look at the urban light, and this creates many impacts, like I explained before, for wildlife in terms of their communication, their navigation, and their behavior. So before I explain what's going to come to the text, on the right you are seeing two kind of examples for urban sprawl, where you can see in red you see the urban center, high density urban center, and in the orange you see low density residential areas, and it kind of shows over the time, like as a animated time series, how urban sprawl happens. And you can also see in the lower image the urban development happens around a river floodplain, which is actually not unusual to observe, particularly in North America and Europe. So, um, the urbanization trend in the US is quite interesting. You do see, because of the urbanization trend, you see this urban rural gradient, starting from the urban center in cities. You see sort of an environmental gradient with variable levels of development and land cover modification as you move towards more rural areas. So in the northeastern part of the US, in the northern and the eastern part of the US, you actually have a lot of more well-developed urban centers, right? And then as you move towards the south and the west, right, you tend to see much more rural, less developed areas. So there's a kind of a continental wide gradient of urbanization in the US. And so along this urban rural gradient, you start from a large central city, which from which it radiates into smaller towns and then to suburbs and then to exurban environments, ultimately going towards rural areas. Now, exurban is kind of the extent of development or the kind of the environment you see between suburbs and rural areas. And so more towards the exurban and suburban area, what you see is a low density, large single family housing units that are scattered over a large area, right? I mean, what we call is a neighborhood. Um, and these kind of areas, you find so in suburbs, you actually see much more higher density of housing aggregations, housing unit aggregations, building aggregations. But as you move away from the suburban areas, in suburbs, in exurbs, you tend to see much more lower density of building construction, right? And every housing unit tends to be much larger, have a greater footprint, and those are mostly single family units, and they have a greater neighbor or interbuilding distances. So in these exurban areas, you don't see a lot of like a single central socioeconomic hubs. Rather, you see a diffused socioeconomic hubs. And then, because of this very scattered development in the exurbs, what you see is farmlands and wildlands intervening with each other. So because of that, this exurban development um, actually can result in much more damaging extents of habitat loss and disconnectivity between habitats than what you experience in an urban area. Remember, urban areas have been historic. Most urban areas that we have in the world today are historic. So their habitat loss is much more, have happened a long time ago. It's a defaunation, loss of native biodiversity has happened over a long time, but these exurban areas can be saved. So concurrently, the biodiversity loss of ecosystem processes and functions happening in the exurb areas are much more dramatic than what you experience concurrently in suburbs or urban environments. And also there's a lots of wetland habitats and aquatic habitats in these exurbs, but those areas are also in very high demand for development, particularly due to their aesthetic values or due to the scenic beauty. Like you see in the bottom image, there is lots of development happening around um, the river system. In the top image, actually, the development is happening in a valley, right, surrounded by the mountains. So that valley could be kind of a traveling hub for most wildlife moving from one mountain to another. But with this development, it actually hinders navigation between different populations. Um, and these exurban areas, unlike urban areas, or suburbs, do not have mass public transportation. So that actually leads to traffic density, right? Um, and that increases the carbon footprint, right? And also increases the pollution to a significant level, right? Air and water pollution happens because there's a lot of traffic, lots of sparse but extensive development happening. And loss of wetlands actually minimizes the chance of flood mitigation or carbon sequestration or pollution remediation. Now, instead of that kind of an exurban type development, happening traditionally around urban areas, what if you concentrate different urban areas, different urban clusters, and create a mega urban region or create these hyper cities? Well, that will actually cluster the development towards this particular area where the environment has already been damaged. So the rest of the area outside that urban cluster, you will have very extensive wildlands, wetlands to conserve for the protection, for biodiversity preservation, for ecosystem function preservation. And also that since those areas are more extensive and connected, you don't have any problem with fragmentation now. Um, that will reduce the stress to the wildlife because there are less stressful wildlands now available for conservation, and the ecosystems are intact, so their ecosystem functions are much more efficient. Carbon sequestration can be much more efficient. Flood mitigation and mitigation of other environmental hazards could be much effective. Wetlands are now a lot more extensive, so their functions are much better, which could include pollution mitigation, pollution remediation. Um, so heating and cooling systems could also be more efficient if you have this clustered urban environments, because there could be a one central heating or cooling system that actually manages more than one unit. So it actually also minimizes the actual energy footprint of urban areas. You can also introduce now mass public transportation systems and other non-mechanized transportation systems, like cyclings or walkways. So that also again minimizes the carbon footprint um, of that overall developed anthropocentric cultural landscape. So this new concept of sustainability has been well adopted by Portland of Oregon. So I'll give you a few examples, and there's a lot more you can research on your own, which I do encourage you to do. This is a highway, right, which used to be, which appears in black and white because you don't see it anymore, right? It's actually, more historical. Now looks like this. It has become an urban park, right? Which allows, which actually creates some wild habitats as well as some opportunities for nature-based recreation for Portland citizens, right? And within that, you have lots of this wildlands and open green space that provides recreational as well as conservation opportunities, right? And the development is more clustered now to the urban areas where there is a clear fringe between urban and rural environments. Rather than an urban rural gradient, now you have an urban environment, urban fringe, and then the wildlands. And even within the urban environment, you can have these urban parks that are less manicured but more wild, right? And then within these urban areas, you can have this major, public transportation systems that minimizes the extent of single vehicle use. Um, and then with that comes in the responsibility of recycling and waste segregation, which actually helps recycling and reuse, right? And with that, you actually get the opportunity to have these urban farming systems, and then of course these flea markets that are geared towards um, production and sales of locally grown produce. So, like I mentioned before, with urban sprawl, you actually have much more natural capital degradation happening, particularly because of, like you see in this picture, the suburban development, development of these neighborhoods can have a major transformation in the land use and land cover. It will lose, these traditional farmlands, that may have actually supported conservation of for certain birds, and it creates fragmentation and loss of many types of habitats that are important for wildlife. Problems with aquatic systems, right? Increased use of pesticides and this pesticides and herbicides over these lawns will increase pollution of surface water and groundwater. That will also, create risks of flooding. And in terms of the energy, air, and climate, like it increases the use of fossil fuel, right? Waste generation, carbon dioxide emissions, air pollution, and then there are economic problems, right? So when a particular upstream area of a watershed, right, is actually polluting their systems, it escalates downstream. You might have buildings closing, businesses going down in downstream, right? um, Unemployment will follow up after that. So yeah, urban sprawl is actually, it apparently seems like a solution um, to socio-chemical problems, but it actually is a patch. It creates more problems than it solves, to be honest. So this graphic kind of summarizes the input and output of material and energy into and from an urban environment. There's a lot of energy input through burning and combustion of fossil fuel from hydroelectricity, um, and then of course huge demand for food and water for the citizens, right? And then a lot of raw material extracted from elsewhere brought over here, huge demands for transportation of goods and services and people, right? And manufacturing goods happening over there based on the raw materials, right? And then well, the monetary flow, right? And then outputs, well, solid wastes, liquid wastes, heat, air pollution, water pollution, right? Emission of greenhouse gases, um, transportation of the manufactured good to elsewhere, noise, light pollution, right? So and the wealth redistribution. So there are lots of movement of stuff, but like I mean, that's very good coming out of it. Mostly, what is coming out of it is the things that are more harmful. And cities have a large ecological footprint. They have very little native vegetation cover, increased exotic vegetation cover, increased invasive species prevalence, increased prevalence of weedy species, increased prevalence of human commensals, right? And reduced coverage of aquatic habitats, wetlands, greater increment in the impervious layers that prevents groundwater infiltration, right? Creation of this urban heat islands, which actually drives, or aggravates impacts of climate change furthermore and contribute to climate change by increasing the carbon footprint. Um, and then, of course, formation of this photochemical smog that I explained earlier with respect to the pollution lecture, right? And then creation of artificial light and artificial noise. So there's a huge multifaceted environmental impacts stemming from conventional urban cities. This is what those western coastal cities have recognized. That's why they're spending so much money to transform the conventional cities into the modern zonation based, conservation driven, sustainability driven systems. Now I'm going to talk about an interesting research I finished early this year with respect to Sri Lanka, which is an Indian Oceanic tropical island. So the study I did revolves around a particular river basin. It's Kalani River Basin. If you look at the name of the river basin is up on the top of the legend, right? So if you look at the top one, it shows the land use land cover system. So the left hand side of that water basin is actually the river mouth. The right hand side is actually the headwater system. You can see clearly at the river mouth there's a extremely high level of urban development. Well, it's not a surprising because it's closer to a river mouth, a major navigable river. So historically, the city of Colombo, the capital of Sri Lanka, the commercial capital of Sri Lanka, developed around that environment, and there was a lot of urban development, from the colonial period up to today. It keep happening. So the lowermost part of the basin has almost no open green space. It's highly altered developed environment and a few wetlands here and there. And then in the mid-reach section of the basin, right, you see some form of like a very extensive multi-crop farming systems, and most of those farming systems are industrial monoculture plantations. um, and then as you navigate more towards the watershed, right, you do see like a significant amount of green space coming up, more forested areas. Now that is actually that area is kind of the mountainous areas, the mountain tropical system. So kind of hard to farm in those areas. That's one reason why there is so much urban green space. And still up in the like uppermost area of the watershed, you again see the appearance of estate-based farming practices, predominantly tea, speckling the entire area of the upper watershed, as well as like there's a huge cluster of that happening within the uppermost area of this particular watershed. Now, still, about uh, a third or somewhere between a third and a quarter of the entire watershed remains forested. But look at image, the map below. The green space in that map are the current extent of protected areas. Now that represents less than 10% of the entire watershed. So in this river basin, the primary take-home message that we try to deliver in our paper was that there's so much opportunity for conservation. There is still intact lands within unaltered part of the watershed, but the conservation agencies have not invest much effort to prevent further development in that area. If you look at kind of um, the upper watershed area, right? Still, because of the farming practices, there's a significant extent of fragmentation, right? And those farms are only going to keep growing. So the best way to prevent that kind of a farming growth is to acquire those, large tracts of wild lands for conservation. There's opportunity, but it hasn't happened thus far, right? So that's actually one major thing we wanted to point it out. So in the upper watershed, that's actually the kind of the characteristic environment you see. Very extensive forest covers, right? and intact river valleys, right? But in the lower reaches, that's what you see, right? Development happening all the way up to the river channel. There is no riparian area, right? So that's because in Sri Lanka we have an obsolete ordinance called Crown Ordinance, which was initiated by the European colonists, um, but which is grossly inadequate to effectively protect a major river system, right? It requires, somewhere between 30 to 40-foot buffer around the major river, but as you can clearly see, that ordinance is obsolete or ignored, or pressed over socio-economical development. Otherwise, how can you have something like that? I mean, something very similar to this is what's happening in the Thames River in England. There's development happening right to the edge of the river. Kind of ridiculous. And then, this certain like this slum like development also, yeah, which are completely illicit, but like I don't see police being active or taking any actions regarding uh, this location of these properties, right? Because that is the floodplain, right? It's a riparian zone as part of the floodplain. Yeah, this river basin, at its river mouth, actually acquires a huge swath of a floodplain, right? So in a major monsoon, all of those construction, all of those infrastructure, all of those buildings can get inundated. It has happened several times, but that didn't help. That did not prevent people rebuilding after a flood. It's kind of a very sad situation. I'm limiting this case study at this level, but there's a lot of other take-home messages, but I'm going to limit it to this level for now. So some of the older cities in the world have, a lot of problems, right? Particularly the slum like development, they don't have any sanitary conditions, right? So I guess where, or what they use as toilets. And as a result, because of these unsanitary conditions, urban environments are filled with invasive species, disease vectors, and weedy species like rats, flies, roaches, mosquitoes, you name it. And then actually in I think with respect to certain cities in India and in Mexico, there is something called fecal snow happening. What happens is actually since there's so much fecal matter deposited in urban environments, when that dries out, the wind picks it up, right? And then it blows across back around the cities, and it actually snows back into this area. So that's what you call by a fecal snow. It's literally shit raining on you, your own shit raining on you, right? And that will leads to spread of diseases like hepatitis C, salmonella, and many other waterborne diseases, foodborne diseases, right? And then there's a lots of automobile movements, factories that actually creates very hot environments. In fact, if you are building up a city in a like a ball like area where you're looking at kind of a valley that is surrounded by multiple mountains. A best example I can think about is several cities in Mexico, right? They are surrounded by like about two or three mountain ranges. So what happens is the vehicle exhaust, the automobile exhaust, factory exhaust generated stagnates within the city, right? That leads to smog formation, which is a very serious form of air pollution because smogs do not disappear. Smog formation makes the smog stagnant, it lingers around, and it kind of compounds the effect of air pollution. Um, and then I did mention earlier about water depletion in groundwater systems and that leading to a land subsidization, which happens in Mexico. And then the because of the greater population, it actually has the public transportation, if not very well managed, well timed, it actually kind of develops in a very unprecedented way, again contributing to air pollution, right? um, but the strategies you can take in order to mitigate this problem is kind of develop a centralized, well managed public, well timed public transportation system, largely depending on like mass scale public transportation, right? Rather than small buses, use train systems, subway systems that will actually mitigate the traffic. And then relocating factories to certain industrial zones within the city, right? And then banning use of automobiles in certain parts of the city where there is a residential component, or where there are more human traffic, human foot movement, human not human traffic, foot traffic. Um, and then have established measurements to measure how much what is polluted, and then try to trace back that to the automobiles or factories that is responsible for emission of those pollutants, right? And one way to do that is actually ban older cars, right? Older cars have older engines that are very less effective in terms of filtering or retaining pollutants, right? So ban them, get rid of them, right? Find users that actually not adhere to the regulations. Create more urban green space, right? So what you can see in this some of these pictures on the bottom left and top right, they are using these highway pillars, highway systems, those side walls, as a means to grow vegetation, grow plants, grow climbers, right? Like grow trees on the sidewalks, right? Grow uh, vegetation on the median strip. That will actually increase the greenery, and that will help mitigating air pollution, trapping air pollutants, and also absorbing carbon to a certain level. Create water processing centers. The best way to do that is actually create artificial wetlands for the purpose of filtering and treating urban storm flow, right? Create vertical gardening. Now, vertical gardening is what you see when you grow climbers or creeper like vegetation along pillars on walls. That's what you see in one of the top images as well. And also, rather than sprawling the development, make high-rise apartments. So actually, it takes less space on the ground as the vertical construction creates more space for the residents to occupy. So, how do you create individual responsibility in a city to mitigate pollution? Well, what is the source of pollution? Well, earlier we said industries and automobile. Well, how do you run them? Well, by fossil fuel. How about imposing a gas tax, right? So that will actually encourage people to seek alternative energy sources and to stay, and to drive their car less, because the less you drive, less gas you need, right? Um, Actually, I think Singapore city has been successful in establishing some of these rules. They actually have kind of a um, taxation system, and to monitor how much a particular car is driven, how much you use highways. So there you can impose a limit to how much you can use the highway to a lower pay and increase that particular pay as you use your car a lot more, right? And actually, so in the same way, you can monitor individual vehicle for pollution, right? For emission for the vehicle exhaust, right? And you can actually have like a parking fee. If you use a car, you have to park it somewhere. So impose a parking fee, which which will deter people to use private transportation and increase the private transportation, right? Um, and then of course kind of a auction type way to sell cars. So when you auction a car, you actually can actually increase the sale price, right? So you can auction the right to drive a car, right, so that it mitigates pollution. And then I did mention about these high-rise buildings that will mitigate the extensive surface development or habitat loss in urban environments, right? And that will also lead to clustering development, where you set apart urban areas, high density urban areas from wildland. So, like I mentioned, instead of a gradient, you see clear clustering, see as a very distinct zonation. The most important part is actually informing the public, educating the public about how to manage their own town. So, public outreach, science-based public education is more important. Is extremely important, which can then lead into public policy formations. So, when the politicians come up with policies, they are informed. The politicians themselves are informed scientifically, and the public are also informed. So they will actually make voting decisions based on, not based on just the social economic benefits, but also based on environmental policies. So can this cluster development be a reality? If you look at the picture to the right side, you are looking at on the top undeveloped land before any kind of a development, and then the typically how development happens, which happens through very sprawling manner, which consumes lots of natural land cover and leaves very little as open green space. The clustering development actually is where you assess the landscape first, understand what kind of habitats you have, and preserve as much diverse array of habitats as much as possible, while also supporting continuity and then limiting the development to high density housing units in certain restricted areas, right? And then on the left side, you actually see how you create urban green spaces, right? The top image comes from Chicago, right? They actually have created these multi-habitat urban preserves within the city core um, that promotes urban refuge for purpose of conservation, right? And then this rooftop gardening, right? That's again a practice that is kind of very popular in Chicago and to a certain level in becoming popular in Boston and New York, but not to the same level as in Chicago. And very popular in the western coastal cities, like on the top of the roof, like, rather than having like a unused area, like use it for gardening, grow vegetables, grow crops on it, grow natural vegetation on it. And that can actually be used to cool the building, right? And also to retain and use the rainwater, or the wastewater generated within the building. And also you can create some sort of a filtration system, wetland based filtration system on the roof of a building, um, to retain and collect and reuse the rainwater, right? Or you can use those, like the roof systems for solar panel systems, right? To create solar panels. And and also you can use geothermal energy when you construct a building. You think about all of this. What am I going to do with my roof? Am I going to build a particular part as urban roof garden? Can I put solar panels on it and generate electricity, right? Or can I also think about the geothermal energy that I can use, that can be used um, to heat the home or the building during winter, right? And also um, develop some sort of a cooling system with respect to rooftop gardening or rooftop engineering to cool the building during summer, right? And on the bottom picture, bottom center picture, you're looking at a very elaborative way of vertical gardening where parts of certain buildings, or rather like kind of a parking lot like structures, are being constructed vertically for purpose of um, gaining natural land cover, gaining more greenery for recreation purposes, right? Or for farming purposes, you can do that. Now you are not using lands on the surface, you are actually kind of putting it on tiers, like a multi-story story farming system. Okay, usually I elaborate this part quite a lot, but with everything going on, I'm going to stop this particular topic. And with that, we conclude the entire lecture series on environmental sciences. All right, folks, good luck. And I will post information about the exam pretty soon. And I haven't decided when to open it up, but at least I will open it up during the week of exam. So you have plenty of time to study between now and then, and plenty of time to take the exam. Remember, the exam is going to be take home, and you will have plenty of time to do it. All right, folks, again, good luck. Sorry the semester ended in this way.